Pick a side, Sienna. Brennan, give him the envelope. No, you heard your wife. Don't embarrass her again. Isn't he just facilities compliance? Please, for once, don't make me choose your pride over my future. The one nobody in this room was supposed to see? Lock the doors. Earlier that evening, I was still polishing my grandfather's cufflinks, wondering if Sienna would finally be proud to stand beside me. The cufflinks were older than my marriage, older than Orion, older than most things I still believed in. 2 small navy stones set in brushed silver, worn smooth at the edges from 3 generations of hands. My grandfather used to say a man's cufflinks should be the only thing about him that shouted, because everything else ought to speak in a quieter voice. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in a tailored navy tuxedo, working the second cufflink through the stiff cotton of my cuff, and I could hear Sienna moving through the bedroom behind me, the soft rustle of tulle, the click of an earring case opening and closing. "You've been standing in that bathroom for 10 minutes, she said. "I'm almost done." "You're always almost done." She appeared in the doorway in a pastel pink gown, her black hair pinned into a neat bun, a few loose strands framing her face like she'd planned them to look unplanned. She was beautiful in the specific way she'd always been beautiful to me. Not loud, not performed, at least not back when I first knew her. "You look incredible," I said, and I meant it. Tonight is not the night to challenge Dalton. I turned from the mirror. Why would I need to challenge him? "Because you always act like you know something everyone else doesn't." She said it lightly, the way you'd toss a pillow across a room, but it landed somewhere heavier. I didn't answer. I clipped the second cufflink into place and reached for my jacket. "It's the anniversary gala," she said, softer now, like she was trying to smooth over something she'd only meant to test. "They're finally announcing the new CEO tonight. It matters to me, Brennan. My name is attached to the whole event. Every press release, every seating chart, every word on that stage, that's my department. That's mine." "I know." "Do you?" She studied me in the mirror's reflection. "Sometimes I wonder if you know what any of this means to me." I wanted to tell her. God, there were nights I wanted to tell her so badly it kept me awake, staring at the ceiling of a house I'd bought with money she thought came from careful budgeting and a modest compliance salary. But the words never came, because telling her meant unraveling years of a story I'd built brick by brick. And some part of me, maybe the coward part, maybe the part still grieving my brother, believed that if she loved the truth more than she loved me, I needed to know that before it was too late to protect myself. So I said, "I know it means everything to you. Let's not be late." We took my sedan, navy blue, with a persistent rattle, somewhere under the dash that I'd never bothered to get fixed because I liked it. It reminded me the car still ran, still did its job. Didn't need to be flashy to get us where we were going. Sienna sat with her clutch in her lap, watching the Atlanta skyline slide by through the window, saying nothing. At the hotel entrance, the valet opened her door first, offered his hand, and she stepped out like a woman arriving at her own coronation. Then he came around to my side, glanced at the car, and something crossed his face. Not quite a smirk, but close enough that I felt it in my chest anyway. "Sir, will you be needing valet, or—" "Valet's fine," I said, and handed him the keys. Sienna didn't look back at the car. She'd already started toward the entrance, chin lifted, smiling at someone she recognized in the distance. I caught up to her under the awning. Maybe next time we take a car service, she said, not looking at me. Or I could arrange something through the company account. It would look better. Better for who? She hesitated. For the event, Brennan. Everyone who matters is going to be here tonight. I understood in that moment, something I'd suspected for a while and never wanted to confirm. She wasn't embarrassed by the car. She was embarrassed by what the car represented. A husband who drove himself to work in a compliance badge and came home smelling like a warehouse, while she stood in rooms full of people who talked about supply chain innovation like it was poetry. I let it go. I always let it go. That was, I would come to understand before the night was over, one of my worst habits. The founder's legacy gala filled the entire ballroom of the Ashcroft Grand. 600 chairs wrapped in ivory linen, a stage banked in white roses, and a screen 40 feet wide currently displaying the Orion Medical Systems logo in soft blue light. Years earlier, I had built the company out of a garage office with 2 employees and a spreadsheet. Tonight, the company was announcing a new chief executive and a $220 million federal emergency supply contract. The kind of deal that would put Orion's routing software into disaster response programs across a dozen states. Sienna peeled away from me almost immediately, swallowed into a cluster of executives near the champagne table, her laugh rising above the string quartet. I found a spot near the back wall, the place I always found at these events, close enough to see everything, and far enough that no one expected me to perform. That was when Dalton found me. He moved through a crowd the way certain men do, like the crowd existed to part for him. Tall, sharp-jawed, a smile that had probably closed more contracts than his actual sales numbers. He was Orion's chief revenue officer, and by the end of the night everyone expected him to be its next chief executive. "Brennan," he said my name like it amused him. "Good to see you made it past the service entrance. I usually use doors that open." Still funny, still stuck. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. Too hard, too familiar. "You know, most facilities men don't get invited to the founder's gala. Most facilities men don't run compliance for the whole building." "Sure." He glanced past me toward Sienna, who was mid-laugh, her hand resting briefly on the forearm of a hospital administrator. "She's really something tonight, isn't she?" I said nothing. "You're a lucky man, Brennan. I mean that." He smiled again, and this time it didn't reach his eyes. "Enjoy the evening. Try not to wander into anything you don't understand." He walked off toward the stage before I could answer, and I stood there a moment longer than I should have, feeling the specific kind of anger that doesn't show on the outside. My grandfather used to say some men mistake your silence for surrender. He was right more often than I liked to admit. I was halfway to the bar when a young woman in a gray blazer intercepted me near the service hallway, glancing over her shoulder before she spoke. "Mr. Kane, Harper Ellis." I recognized her from the logistics floor, a junior analyst, the kind of employee who still read every footnote in a shipment report because she hadn't yet learned that most people didn't. "Harper, everything all right?" "No." Her voice was tight, controlled, the voice of someone rehearsing calm. She pressed a blue envelope to my hands, sealed. The paper stock heavier than anything you'd find in a supply closet. "I need you to look at this. Tonight, before anyone else does." "What is it?" "Shipment logs. Reroute data. 3 rural hospital contracts that were supposed to get emergency kits last quarter. Meridian Response Partners. I've cross-checked it 4 times. The kits never arrived where they were supposed to. They went to private facility chains instead, ones that pay premium handling fees. She glanced down the hallway again. If I disappear from the system tomorrow, this is why. Who else knows you have this? I don't know. I think I was followed here. She looked at me with the kind of desperation that comes from realizing the adults in the room might not be the adults you thought they were. You're the only person on this floor who's ever actually read what I send up instead of just signing it. I opened my mouth to ask her something else, but she was already moving, walking briskly back toward the staff exit. And that was when I saw him, Dalton, standing near the ballroom archway, watching the whole exchange with an expression I would spend the rest of the night trying to forget. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. Like he'd been waiting for exactly this to happen. I didn't open the envelope right away. I found a quiet corner near the coat check and held it, feeling the wax seal under my thumb. An old habit, checking whether it was real, whether it was one of mine. It was. W14, pressed into blue wax, the way my grandfather taught me before I ever built a company worth protecting. I hadn't sealed this one. Harper had used trust stationery. She must have found somewhere in the executive archive, not knowing what the seal meant, only that it looked official enough to matter. She had, without realizing it, handed me a document formatted exactly like a founder's emergency notice. That was either a coincidence or someone wanted me to notice. I slipped the envelope into my jacket and made my way back toward the ballroom floor. And I hadn't taken 10 steps before Sienna found me, her heels sharp against the marble. "Where have you been?" "Talking to someone from logistics." "Talking to who?" Her eyes moved to the outline of the envelope in my jacket. "What is that?" "Nothing you need to worry about tonight." "Brennan." Her voice dropped, urgent. "Dalton just told me you took something from an analyst who's under review. He said it could be stolen internal documents. Tonight of all nights, with press in the room." "Under review for what?" "I don't know the details, but he said if this becomes a scene, it reflects on my department, on me." She was gripping my arm now, not affectionately. "Please, just hand over whatever it is. Let the board handle it properly tomorrow, not in the middle of the biggest night of my career." I looked at her, at the fear behind her eyes, and I understood, not for the first time but more clearly than ever, that Dalton had already gotten to her before I had a chance to explain anything. He hadn't needed evidence. He'd only needed a story that scared her enough to act on his behalf. "Sienna," I said quietly, "whatever he told you happened tonight. Think about how fast he told it to you." She didn't answer. The lights over the stage dimmed, and the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, and there wasn't time for anything else. The toast came first. Dalton took the stage in a black tuxedo that fit him like a costume, built for exactly this moment, and he praised the company, praised the anniversary, praised Sienna by name for years of communications excellence, though she'd only worked there half that time, which got a warm laugh from the room. Then he found me in the crowd. "Some people build companies," he said, smiling out over 600 faces. "Some people spend their lives checking other people's work." Laughter, scattered but real. I felt Sienna stiffen beside me. Saw her look down at the tablecloth instead of at me. I said nothing. I'd learned a long time ago that silence held long enough unsettles a certain kind of man more than any argument could. Dalton's smile flickered, just slightly, like he'd expected a reaction and hadn't gotten one. "Tell the room, Brennan," he said, louder now, and I realized he was building to something. "Are you protecting the company, Or are you just angry your wife finally has a future you didn't provide? Careful, Dalton, I said. The room is recording you. He laughed, not understanding it was a warning and not a threat. He thought I meant it figuratively. Let's talk about the envelope in your jacket, he said, stepping down off the stage now, closing the distance, and the room's attention swung fully toward us like a held breath. Everyone here should know that Mr. Kane just accepted internal documents from a junior employee who is currently under disciplinary review for data manipulation. If he's holding stolen material, I think we deserve to know. It's not stolen, I said. Then hand it over. No. The word landed harder than I meant it to, flat and final. And I watched something shift across Sienna's face. Not doubt in Dalton, but fear of the moment itself. Fear of 600 people watching her husband refuse a public request in the middle of her gala. Dalton turned to her, and his voice softened into something almost gentle, almost kind, which was somehow worse. Sienna, he said, pick a side. Pick a side, Sienna. Dalton held out his hand like the ballroom belonged to him. I watched my wife's face, the same face I had watched change over the course of our marriage, through her mother's funeral, through 2 miscarriages. We never talked about again, through the early years when she used to fall asleep with her head on my chest, saying she'd never met a man so unbothered by other men's noise. That woman looked at me now like I was the noise. Brennan, she said, give him the envelope. No. You heard your wife, Dalton said. Don't embarrass her again. A security guard I didn't recognize started toward me, and somewhere behind me I heard a woman whisper to her husband, "Isn't he just facilities compliance?" Like the question answered itself. Sienna looked out at the crowd, really looked, taking in the cameras, the board members, the reporters from 2 regional outlets who'd been invited specifically to cover the CEO announcement, and then back at Dalton, and something in her seemed to collapse inward. Please, she said, for once, don't make me choose your pride over my future. I felt the slap before I heard it. My head turned with the force of it, my cheek burning, and the room made a sound I can only describe as a held breath breaking all at once. The blue envelope slipped from my hand and hit the marble floor. Dalton stepped forward and crushed the wax seal under his shoe, grinding it flat, and I watched his face as he did it. Satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of a man who believes he's just erased something dangerous. Then, chairwoman Lillian Crow stood up so fast her champagne spilled across the white tablecloth. "Where did you get that seal?" she said, and her voice had none of the practiced softness I'd heard from her in 100 board meetings. This was something else. Fear, barely controlled. Dalton blinked, still smiling, not understanding yet. What seal? I touched my cheek, felt the heat still rising there, and looked down at the broken blue mark scattered across the marble. That one, I said. The one nobody in this room was supposed to see. Lillian turned toward the ballroom's entrance, and her voice carried across 600 silent guests like a gavel coming down. "Lock the doors." Grant Sullivan, Orion's head of security, had been standing near the stage the whole night, and I watched him hesitate, just half a second, caught between 2 competing instructions. Dalton had told him earlier to keep an eye on the facility situation. Lillian was now telling him something else entirely. He chose the chairwoman. 2 of his men moved to the main doors and drew them shut. A murmur rolled through the room, confusion turning quickly into something closer to alarm. Somewhere near the press table, I saw a reporter already typing. Dalton's confidence cracked for the first time all night. "You don't take orders from her over me," he said to Grant. "At board events, I do," Grant answered, and stepped back to his position by the door. Sienna stood frozen a few feet from me, her hand still faintly red from the impact, staring at it like she couldn't quite believe it belonged to her. Lillian crossed the room, ignoring the whispers, and knelt briefly by the broken wax on the floor, studying the fragments the way you'd study a body at a crime scene. When she rose, she looked at me, not at Dalton, not at Sienna, at me, with an expression I'd only seen from her once before, in a lawyer's office where we'd signed papers neither of us expected to need so soon. "Brennan," she said quietly, "just between us, is it triggered?" "It wasn't supposed to be triggered," I said. "It was supposed to stay in an envelope in my jacket for another year, maybe longer. It's on the floor in front of 600 witnesses and 2 reporters. I'm aware." Sienna's head turned sharply between us. "What is that supposed to mean?" She looked down at the wax fragments, then up at me. "What is W14? Dalton tried to laugh it off, though it came out thinner than he intended. "It's a prop, some kind of theater. Brennan likes theater." Lillian didn't look at him. "No, Mr. Reeves," she said. "It is a trigger." She offered nothing else. She didn't need to. The silence that followed did more work than any explanation could have. We didn't move from that spot for nearly 10 minutes. The room stayed sealed, guests murmuring in tight clusters, a few board members drifting toward Lillian with quiet, urgent questions. She answered without ever raising her voice. I stood near the broken seal like a man standing guard over a grave. And Sienna stayed close, though not close enough to touch me, her hand still pressed against her own palm, as if she could undo what it had just done. "Brennan," she said, finally, low enough that only I could hear, "talk to me. What did I just do?" "You did what he asked you to do." "That's not what I'm asking." Her voice cracked slightly. "What is that seal? What have you been keeping from me?" I could have told her everything in that moment. Years condensed into 30 seconds. A dead brother, a trust fund, a company built from grief and disguised as a spreadsheet job. But I looked at her hand, still raised faintly from the memory of striking me, and something in me closed instead of opened. "Something I hoped I would never need," I said. A side door opened before she could respond, and a woman I recognized immediately walked through it with the kind of calm that only comes from decades of practicing law in rooms exactly like this one. Corinne Walsh, Trust Counsel, carrying a sealed blue folder under one arm like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. "The duplicate was filed 2 hours ago," she said, addressing Lillian directly, though her eyes moved briefly to Dalton. "Digital timestamp, notarized copy, full chain of custody. Whatever was destroyed on this floor tonight was never the only record." Dalton went very still. "Filed under whose authority?" he asked, and for the first time all night, his voice had lost its performance. Corinne didn't answer him. She looked at me instead. "Mr. Kane," she said, "the board is ready when you are." Sienna turned to me slowly, and I watched a question form behind her eyes that she wasn't yet brave enough to ask out loud. Earlier that evening felt like a different life, and in some ways it was. The last few hours I'd spend as the man Sienna thought she'd married. But before I tell you what happened next in that ballroom, you should understand why any of this mattered enough to build a hidden trust, a false title, and years of careful silence around a single wax seal. My younger brother, Tobias, died when I was still young myself. He was working a summer construction job outside a small town south of Atlanta when a support beam gave out and crushed most of his lower body. The local hospital didn't carry the surgical kit he needed to stop the internal bleeding in time. The nearest facility that did carry it was too far away, and the kit that should have already been in that rural hospital's inventory had been reallocated earlier to a wealthier regional center that requested faster restocking and paid a premium for it. Tobias died in a hallway waiting for a transfer that never came. I sat in that hospital for hours afterward, not moving, doing math in my head that I would keep doing for the rest of my life. How many minutes separated a boy who lived from a boy who didn't? How a spreadsheet decision made by someone who never met him had decided which hospital got which supplies. How efficiency and profitability could quietly become a filter for whose life mattered enough to save quickly. I didn't build Orion Medical Systems to get rich. I built it because I couldn't stop doing that math, and the only way I knew to make it stop was to build a system where geography and profitability never again decided who got left waiting in a hallway. My grandfather gave me his cufflinks the week I filed the paperwork, and he told me something I've repeated to myself more times than I can count. Build something that remembers people who never make the news. I built the routing software myself in a rented garage office with 2 employees and a folding table for a desk. It grew faster than I ever expected, and somewhere along the way I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I didn't want to become a celebrity founder. I didn't want my name on the building, my face in trade magazines, my grief turned into a marketing story about triumph. I placed my controlling shares into the Kane Foundation Trust, named for my grandfather and for Tobias. And I asked Lillian Crow, then a rising attorney I'd hired to help structure the trust, to serve as the company's public chairwoman. Then I took a modest job inside my own company, facilities compliance, loading docks, warehouse safety forms, shipment audits, employee complaints. I wanted to see the truth of the system from the bottom, where the real damage happens. Not from a glass office where numbers arrive already sanitized. Only Lillian knew who I really was. Not the board, not the executives, not until the night of the gala, my own wife. I met Sienna 2 years after I founded Orion, back when the company was still small enough that I could disappear into it without anyone questioning why the compliance manager drove a better car than his salary explained, or why he sometimes took calls from the chairwoman that lasted longer than any facilities issue warranted. She was working as a junior communications associate for a nonprofit at the time, sharp, funny, unimpressed by titles, in a way I found enormously attractive after years of watching investors circle Orion, looking for a piece of something they didn't build. She used to tell me in the early years that I made ordinary life feel safe. That was the phrase. Safe. Not exciting, not impressive. Safe. I loved her for noticing that safety was worth something. But safety curdles into something else. When a woman spends years watching other people's husbands get corner offices and public recognition, while hers keeps the loading dock schedule. When Sienna joined Orion's communications department years into our marriage, she was good at her job, genuinely gifted, promoted twice within a short span. And she began, slowly, to measure her own worth against the executives she worked alongside every day. Compared to them, I looked smaller. Compared to them, I was smaller, at least on paper, and paper was increasingly what mattered to her. Dalton Reeves arrived at Orion around that time, and he was, from the very beginning, generous with the kind of compliments that work exactly like a key in a lock. "You belong in bigger rooms," he told her once in front of me at a company dinner. And I remember the way she'd glanced at me afterward, not guiltily, but almost apologetically, like she agreed with him and hated that she did. "Brennan doesn't understand your level," he told her another time, according to what I pieced together later from people who'd overheard it. "A woman like you needs a man who can stand beside power, not one who cleans up after it." I heard fragments of these conversations over the years, half through hallway gossip, half through my own quiet observation, and I never confronted either of them directly. That was my failure, as much as anything Dalton engineered. I told myself I was being patient, being dignified, letting my actions speak instead of my ego. In truth, I was hiding. And hiding, I would eventually understand, creates exactly the kind of silence a man like Dalton can fill with whatever story he wants to tell. The first real crack came about 2 years before the gala, when Sienna found a blue envelope in my study, unsealed, waiting to be delivered to Lillian. "Is this another compliance thing?" she asked, turning it over in her hands, studying the paper stock that was clearly nicer than anything a facilities department would use. "Something like that," I said. She didn't ask again. I've thought about that moment more than almost any other in our marriage. The door she opened, and I quietly closed. If she had pushed harder, if I had told her the truth right there in that study, maybe none of what followed would have happened. But we both, in our own ways, chose not to look. Later, I learned that Dalton had gotten hold of a similar detail, maybe from an assistant, maybe from a records request he had no business making, and used it to plant a seed with Sienna that I was playing at something, pretending at an importance I didn't actually have, hoarding petty secrets to feel powerful in a marriage where he believed I had nothing real to offer. "He's just a compliance man pretending to matter," Dalton told her, according to a message I would later see in the board's investigation file. "Don't let him make you feel small for wanting more." She chose to believe him. I understood why, even as it broke something in me. Dalton gave her a story that made sense of her own quiet resentment. I only gave her silence. The fraud itself, once I understood its full shape, was almost elegant in its cruelty. Dalton's division had been rerouting emergency medical shipments, the surgical kits, trauma supplies, and disaster response inventory, meant for rural hospital partners, through a shell logistics vendor called Meridian Response Partners. Meridian charged Orion a priority handling fee for expedited delivery, then quietly redirected a significant percentage of that inventory to private hospital chains that paid premium contracts for faster restocking. The rural hospitals, the ones like the one that failed my brother, waited longer, sometimes days longer. The internal metrics still looked excellent on paper, because Dalton's team reported an 18% improvement in emergency delivery times without disclosing that the improvement applied almost entirely to wealthier facilities, while smaller rural partners absorbed the delay. Sienna's communications department published the story Dalton wanted told. Orion expands rural care access. New AI routing reduces waste. She signed off on releases that were at best incomplete and at worst actively misleading, not because she was corrupt, but because she trusted the numbers Dalton's team handed her, and never asked who had generated them or why. Harper Ellis was the only person who checked. She noticed, buried in 3/4 of shipment logs, that certain rural contracts consistently arrived understaffed and undersupplied, while performance bonuses in Dalton's division kept climbing. She flagged it internally, twice. Both times her concerns were quietly redirected into a performance review questioning her data interpretation methods, a paper trail Dalton was already building to discredit her before she went further. She came to me because I was the only person on that floor who still read the footnotes. Back in the ballroom, Corinne Walsh opened the blue folder in front of the board, in front of Lillian, in front of nearly 200 guests who hadn't yet been allowed to leave. Dalton insisted the envelope Harper had given me was fabricated, unauthorized, possibly stolen. The original seal was never the evidence, Corinne said, calm as still water. It was the alarm. This is absurd, Dalton said, though his voice had thinned considerably since the toast. You're all treating a piece of wax like it's a court order. It's Article 14 of the Kane Foundation Trust, Lillian said, and this time she said it loud enough for the room to hear. An emergency founder intervention clause, triggered by evidence of patient harm, executive fraud, or the destruction of protected trust documents. You triggered it yourself, Mr. Reeves, the moment you crushed that seal under your shoe in front of 2 reporters. Dalton turned to look at me, and something behind his eyes finally shifted from contempt to calculation. Founder, he repeated slowly, testing the word. I didn't answer him directly. Lillian did instead. Mr. Kane has authority in this room that most of you were never cleared to know, she said, addressing the wider crowd now, her voice carrying to the back tables, where the press sat with their phones raised. Sienna turned to me, her face pale beneath the gala lighting. What does she mean? It means you should listen before you choose wrong again, I said, and I watched the words land somewhere I couldn't take back. Dalton tried one more move. It was, in its own way, the cruelest thing he did all night, though not the most surprising. Sienna approved every public statement my division issued, he said, turning toward the board, toward the reporters, toward anyone who would listen. She reviewed the numbers. She signed the releases. If there's fraud here, it runs through her department as much as mine. She pursued this relationship. She helped manage the narrative. And she's the one who brought her husband's little envelope stunt into a room full of investors tonight. I watched Sienna's face as he said it. Watched years of marriage and God knows how long of whatever she'd shared with Dalton collapse into the plain, ugly math of a man protecting only himself. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence told the room everything Dalton's accusation hadn't already confirmed. You finally told the truth about one thing, Dalton, I said quietly. She was useful to you. Lillian called an emergency board vote before Dalton could construct another defense. It took less than 4 minutes. 6 votes to remove him from his position, effective immediately. 1 abstention. Federal health care fraud investigators, whom Lillian had quietly notified the moment she saw the broken wax seal, were waiting outside the ballroom doors Grant had locked earlier. Dalton didn't go quietly, but he went. The screen above the stage, which had been dark since the doors were locked, flickered on some time after Dalton was escorted out. It didn't show his presentation, the one meant to announce his ascension to chief executive. Instead, it showed a scanned founding certificate for Orion Medical Systems, my signature at the bottom, beside a photograph of a garage office with 2 folding chairs and a hand-lettered sign taped to the door. Lillian's voice carried across the silent room. The board recognizes the founder and controlling beneficiary of Orion Medical Systems, she said. Brennan Kane. Nobody applauded. I didn't expect them to, and honestly, I didn't want them to. Applause would have made the moment about triumph, and there was nothing triumphant about a night that had cost me my brother's memory, being dragged into public spectacle, my wife's hand across my face, and a young analyst's safety hanging in the balance an hour earlier. Sienna stared at the screen, then at the guests around her, then at me, and I watched something click into place behind her eyes. The party she'd thought was Dalton's launching pad had, the entire time, been unfolding inside a company her own husband had built out of grief in a rented garage. I didn't hold her gaze long. I looked instead toward the back corner of the room where Harper Ellis stood half hidden behind a pillar, visibly shaking. "Harper," I said, loud enough for her to hear across the room. "Come up here." She walked to where I stood, like she wasn't sure her legs would carry her the whole way. And when she reached me, she said only, "I only wanted someone to check the roots." "You did what this company was built for," I told her. A rural hospital administrator appeared on a video call that Corinne had arranged in advance for exactly this contingency. Her face projected onto the same screen that had just displayed my founding certificate. She confirmed, in a voice steadier than I expected given the circumstances, that critical shipments to her facility had been delayed for weeks, that 2 patients had suffered documented complications directly attributable to the delay, and that Harper's internal reports, the ones Dalton's team had dismissed as unreliable, matched her hospital's records exactly. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not shocked silence. Grief-adjacent silence. The kind that settles over people when they understand fraud wasn't abstract, wasn't just numbers on a slide, but had caused real people real harm. I thought of Tobias in that hallway, too far from the kit that could have saved him, and I thought that if Harper hadn't come to me that night, some other family somewhere might have gotten the same phone call mine did. The board moved quickly once the vote was official. Corinne walked me through the emergency governance provisions I'd written into Article 14 years earlier, half hoping I'd never need them. Grant Sullivan personally escorted Dalton's remaining personal items out of the executive floor the following morning, under supervision, while federal investigators began requesting financial records from Meridian Response Partners. Sienna found me near the coat check sometime after midnight. Most of the guests gone. The ballroom staff quietly clearing centerpieces around us like the whole evening had simply been another event to strike and reset. "Had known," she started. "That is the sentence that ends us," I said, cutting her off. Not cruelly, just honestly. She flinched like I'd struck her, which I suppose was its own kind of symmetry, though I took no satisfaction in it. "You didn't slap me because you didn't know I was powerful," I said. "You slapped me because you thought I wasn't. That's the part I can't unfeel, Sienna. Not the hand. The reason behind it." She had no answer for that. I hadn't expected one. The professional consequences arrived over the following weeks, separate and distinct from whatever remained of our marriage. The board's internal review found that Sienna had signed off on misleading public communications without independently verifying the underlying data, that she had a documented conflict of interest given her relationship with Dalton, and that her department's handling of Harper's internal complaints had contributed to a culture where whistleblowers were quietly punished instead of protected. She was removed from her leadership role in strategic communications, though the board stopped short of terminating her outright, citing her years of otherwise strong work and the absence of direct evidence. She knowingly participated in the fraud itself. I didn't lobby for leniency, and I didn't lobby against it. That decision belonged to people who hadn't been married to her for years and could see the situation without my particular blindness. At home, 3 nights after the gala, I set my wedding ring on the kitchen table between us. Not thrown, not dramatized, just placed there, the way you'd set down something you'd carried long enough. I wore this when I had less than nothing, I told her. You took it seriously only when you found out I had more than enough. She didn't argue. She looked at the ring for a long time, then finally at me, and whatever she wanted to say, she seemed to understand it wouldn't change the fact underneath everything, that I had learned in the worst possible way exactly what she believed she'd married. We separated within the month. There was no public announcement, no press release, no communications department to manage the narrative this time. Just 2 people, quietly filing paperwork in a lawyer's office, much smaller than the one where I'd first signed the trust that protected my company from men like Dalton. And in the end, from the version of my own marriage I'd been too afraid to examine honestly, I didn't become Orion's public chief executive. That was never the point of any of this. Instead, the board appointed Dr. Lena Hart, an operations leader who had spent a decade defending rural hospital logistics contracts against exactly the kind of quiet erosion Dalton had engineered. Harper Ellis was moved into a newly created position, Director of the Office of Route Integrity, reporting directly to the board with explicit protections against retaliation written into her contract by Corinne's office. We recovered a significant portion of the funds Dalton had funneled through Meridian Response Partners, and the board voted unanimously to direct that money into a new initiative, the Tobias Kane Rural Response Fund, supporting emergency kit reserves for underserved hospitals, whistleblower protections across the company, and logistics scholarships for students who wanted to build systems like the one I'd built out of grief. Lillian came to my office a few weeks after the gala, closed the door, and apologized for letting Dalton's influence grow as large as it had before either of us acted. I stayed hidden so long I forgot shadows protect bad men too, I told her, and I meant it as much about myself as about her. Months later, Dalton Reeves was under formal federal indictment for healthcare fraud connected to the Meridian contracts. Sienna took a position at a small nonprofit across town, a job with none of the corporate polish she'd once measured her worth against. I don't know everything about how she's doing now. We're separated, likely heading toward a final divorce, and I've made my peace with the fact that some doors, once they close the way ours did, don't reopen just because enough time passes. A year after the gala, Orion held its next major public event. Not another Founders Legacy Gala with VIP tables and press risers, but something the board renamed Workers and Patients Night. No red carpet, no 40-foot screen displaying a founding certificate. Harper spoke for a few minutes about the Office of Route Integrity. A rural nurse from one of the hospitals we'd once failed to properly supply stood up and told a story about a shipment that arrived on time and helped save a patient's life the week before. I stood near the back of the room in a navy suit the way I always had, and I didn't need to be anywhere near the stage. Before the evening ended, I walked to a small display case near the entrance and placed a new blue envelope inside it. Not the W-14 notice. That one was long since filed away, its work finally done. This one held a scholarship letter, the first one issued under the Tobias Kane Rural Response Fund, addressed to a young logistics student in rural Georgia who reminded me in ways I couldn't quite explain of a 19-year-old boy who never got the chance to become anything at all. A seal is not power, I said quietly to no one in particular, though Harper happened to be standing close enough to hear it. A seal is a promise that somebody will answer when the quiet people call. She nodded, like she understood exactly what I meant. And for the first time since that ballroom went silent under a broken wax mark, I felt like the promise had finally been kept. Comment one moment, when someone judged you by what they could see, not what you were carrying.